Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. Although we are almost at the end of the first month of the current calendar year, there are still 11 more months to go. I wish you all a very happy and healthy 2025, and I hope you had a good first month already. So we will go into the presentation on what the Economic Survey 24-25 is about. This is a presentation on the Economic Survey contents rather than on the state of the economy per se, although which will be there towards the end of the presentation as well. The structure of today's presentation, we will cover the following issues: the changing global landscape and how India can raise the game for the new playing field. And in that segment, we will cover 4 areas, as you can see here: reform through deregulation, augmenting internal capacities for growth, the private sector's role in nation building, the energy transition the Indian way, state of the economy regaining momentum, and the growth outlook for FY26. The changing global landscape, we did cover that in the last survey as well. 2024 was the year of elections across the world. And most of us know that both qualitatively and in terms of quantitative dimensions, the world that existed between 1980, and you can choose the end point, some people would say 2008 or 2012, 16, etc. Roughly about 3 decades was the peak of globalization, hyper-globalization. As you can see in the statistics here, global exports went from 15% plus to 25%. Global FDI flows went from 0.5% of GDP to 3.75% of GDP. Global GDP itself rose 6 times in current prices. Extreme poverty came down because of faster growth in China and India. Internet penetration went from almost nothing to 23% as a share of world population. During this period, applied tariff rates across the world came down and the trade to GDP share went up. But clearly, you all know very well more than we do that this period has kind of ended. Even if we are not reversing very actively, we no longer are advancing along these dimensions. New import restrictions every year were of the order of about 3,000 restrictions imposed by countries across the world. They have jumped to about 5,000 restrictions in the last 4 years. And the key reason that is cited by countries in imposing restrictions is strategic competitiveness. I think that is the important theme that we have to internalize as a country, both in the policy space and in the private sector space. There is strategic competitiveness, so therefore, efficiency considerations have given way to resilience and supply side security considerations. The value of trade covered under the new import restrictions was as low as $170 billion in 2014-15. Now it's more than $1 trillion, $1.3 trillion. So effectively, I think both import-export and investment flows are being looked at through the prism of strategic competition. And that is a new world which may be with us for quite some time to come, and therefore we need to get used to operating in this space. As a result, world FDI net inflows as a percentage of GDP has come down from around 5% in the first decade to around 1% of GDP. And world exports as a share of world GDP peaked, even though it may not have come down as much as investment flows have come down. Clearly, it is on a declining trend compared to the ascending trend we saw towards the end of the last millennium and in the first decade. One of the outcomes of the globalization era was also the rise of China as a manufacturing power. India also rose as a power in global services. So what has happened in the last 25-30 years, and it is continuing even now, is in several high-tech, medium-tech areas, the presence of China is pervasive and dominant, and the manufacturing as a share of world gross output, China's share will probably be higher than the combined share of the next 10 countries. It gives them a lot of strategic levers and advantage in several areas, as we will see later in some other dimensions as well. This is an important development along with globalization in the last 40 years. Now, along with the dominance in manufacturing, in terms of the materials and minerals required for global energy transition, let's first take a look at the solar energy. Global demand in 2010 was, China's share of the global demand was very small, and therefore China's production capacity in those areas was also quite small comparatively. But fast forward 11 years later, while demand has grown even within China, but the production capacity in that country has grown even more than demand, basically giving them an important lever in terms of the source of supply for all ingredients and components related to energy transition. And if you happen to see the September 2024 report of Mr. Mario Draghi on the European competitiveness, the entire 75-page report is full of European concerns about the concentration risk that is there with respect to one country as a source of supply for all critical components and technologies with respect to energy transition and manufacturing, etc. Moving on from solar energy to electric mobility, if you look at the key materials that go into it, copper, lithium, nickel, cobalt, graphite, and the rare earth materials, the dominance, and this is a slide which we have shown you back in July 2024 as well, the dominance of one country is quite clear. And in different stages of production, even if those materials are not mined in one country, the processing happens in a single country, and therefore, whether it is the cell components or battery cells, in fact, the truth is every single panel, solar panel we install, every single electric vehicle that we produce in this country, naturally the dependence on a single source for supply keeps increasing. So that dependence has to be kept in mind in the pace of transition towards renewable energies and also with respect to electric mobility. So this is the global context, that the era of globalization, faster and larger movement of trade and goods and services and investments is behind us. And there is a huge presence of a single country, a phenomena that we have not seen in a very long time, at least since World War II. So given this, naturally, we have to raise the game for a new playing field. The playing field has changed, and the game has to be rely on domestic drivers of growth. So what are those domestic drivers of growth? That is what is part 2 about. Just to recap, we do have a goal, a legitimate economic and social aspiration to become a developed country by 2047. The last economic survey broke it down into multiple components, generating about 80 lakh jobs per year, increasing our share of manufacturing in GDP, plugging Indian businesses into global value chains, and creating a viable small, medium enterprise sector, which in the German language is called the Mittelstand. Because countries that basically became powerhouses in manufacturing had succeeded in creating a viable small medium enterprise sector. Therefore, our goal with respect to manufacturing is inextricably tied to the success of being able to raise the share of SME enterprises as well. Therefore, what is the action? The action is we have to raise our game on domestic growth. And how do we do that? There are 4 dimensions to it. One is deregulation for growth, augmenting internal capacities for growth, the role of the private sector in nation building, and doing energy transition the Indian way. First, we start with the deregulation for growth. Now, when we talk of deregulation, it is not even big ticket deregulation or dismantling of the licensing era, which happened in 1991 and pursued by governments over the last 30 plus years. We are talking about the nuts and bolts or the plumbing of deregulation, which particularly affect enterprises, be they in services or be they in manufacturing, which affect them in terms of the time and the resource bandwidth that they have. And these are related to local level rules, laws, and regulations. So this is the deregulation exercise, which will probably not be a news story in the front pages, but that kind of deregulation at the local and the state government level have to happen pervasively for us not only to boost MSMEs, to boost manufacturing, but also to lift the potential GDP growth in the country. And this applies in the areas of labor and even in the education sector as well. We'll share with you a few examples. These are the areas where I think the regulations that are there today affect the day-to-day activities of businesses that don't have the kind of bandwidth which large enterprises have. Whether it is in land, building and construction, utilities, logistics, and there are sector-specific deregulation areas, and you can see more of them in Chapter 5 and also across other chapters in the economic survey. In general, we are obviously in the presentation, I can't go into all the issues which are there in the chapter. Just to illustrate, compliance costs make it cheaper to run two 150 worker factory than one 300 worker factory, whereas it should be the other way around. Regulations also disproportionately affect small businesses. If you look at the building restrictions, the setbacks to be allowed on all the four sides of a building, the floor area ratio restrictions, parking regulations, etc., take away much of the land available at the ground floor level for businesses. So actually manufacturing can start only from the first floor onwards in many small enterprises, both in urban and rural India, if they fully comply with the letter and spirit of these regulations. Naturally, that raises the fixed cost of doing business, and naturally, it also disincentivizes more hiring. So deregulation is not just about ease of doing business, it is a pathway to employment generation. And naturally, we also know that many states impose a high markup on electricity costs supplied to businesses compared to other non-businesses. And whereas in countries like Vietnam and Bangladesh, particularly in Vietnam, which we look up to, it is the other way around in terms of being our next important competitive country. They have the opposite problem, which is that the cost of electricity supplied to industries is on the lowest side there compared to what we have in India. And by the way, this is not just a theoretical exercise. We have done, and you will see more of it in Chapter 7, we looked at those states which have progressed a lot on business reform action plan, and lo and behold, those states have a much higher level of industrial activity. So there is a positive correlation between BRAP and the level of industrial activity that is there in these states. Moving on from industry to employment-related areas where deregulation can be pursued, in general, we do specify the number of hours workers can work daily and weekly. Every country has it. But the problem is we have restrictions that this shall be adhered to week after week after week, whereas other countries give flexibility to the enterprises to be able to achieve this over a longer period, 3 months or 6 months. Your overall working hours cannot exceed this. But in a given week, there could be more or less work depending on demand surges. So that flexibility is missing. The same thing with respect to Factories Act on overtime working hours as well. The stipulated overtime hours are lower than competing nations, even though the overtime wages are higher in India on paper. The hours that people can be asked to work overtime is limited, and this is something that the workers and the management can negotiate between themselves depending on order flows and so on and so forth. Moving on to higher education in particular, where I think market forces can play a much better role in ensuring quality outcomes. The University Grants Commission specifies minimum credits for various course categories and in what sequence as well. These aspects could be entrusted to the institutions themselves. And the institutions must remain free to remain must be free to remain flexible with their coursework. This will allow them to adapt to changing market demands, and we should basically trust the faculty and students to find solutions to these problems. These are all areas where we don't have to micromanage, and that is something. This is just examples of deregulation we can undertake in industry, employment, and education. Moving on to part B of domestic drivers of growth, this is to continue to do the work we have been doing in the last 10 years on augmenting internal capacities for growth. And in July 2024, in agriculture, we devoted a lot of time in both Chapter 5 on the medium-term outlook on how agriculture can be freed in terms of empowering farmers to be able to produce the maximum value and raise productivity. And we deliberately call it the sector of the future because there is enough scope to raise the contribution of agriculture by 0.75% to 1% in terms of GDP growth by empowering farmers, as we wrote in last July survey. And there are examples which we have cited in this survey as well from different states, and also both in terms of land pooling and also in terms of irrigation potential, which we have done quite well in the last 8 years. The area under micro irrigation has gone up by 3 times, and that can actually be an important factor. So bringing more area under irrigation, land pooling, and giving farmers the freedom to sell wherever, whenever, to whomsoever, at whatever prices, while undertaking different intervention mechanisms to take care of the demand side. That is the right combination that can unlock up to 1% of incremental growth from the agriculture sector. And given our size and given the impact climate change will have on some other nations in Africa and Asia, this will also give India a huge diplomatic and strategic leverage if we are able to become the breadbasket for many countries around the world. So this sector is not something that countries do well in their early stage of development, but given the change in globalization and given climate change, this sector can be a sector for the future as well. And as you see here on the left side, allied sectors in agriculture have been able to grow at much faster rate than the mainstream crops and food grains. So therein lies the clue as to what are all the elements from those areas which can be applied to traditional crop areas that will lift the overall growth rate of the agriculture sector. In terms of infrastructure development, we have done quite well in the last 10 years in particular, whether in terms of introducing new trains, new airports, we're contributing to reduced turnaround time in ports, coming down from 48 hours to 30 hours in the last couple of years, and capacity additions in the power sector, falling data cost, and expansion in telecom infrastructure. These are some of the illustrations we have picked up for highlighting here, but there are more details in Chapter 6. We also, last time itself, we wrote about the turnaround logistics costs also have come down in the country, and turnaround time in toll booths, etc., and road transport are all contributing to higher production and distribution efficiency in the country. Particularly with respect to the urban India, cities declared open defecation free have gone from 15% to saturation coverage, and household latrines constructed, public toilets constructed, and waste processed as a percentage of waste generated. There is tangible and substantial progress in many of these dimensions. On the right side, what you see is that PM Awas Yojana urban and also Amrut in terms of water coverage, 70% tap water and 62% sewage coverage, and also the expansion of metro rail system. The reason we put it up here is that public transportation has to play a much bigger role in our energy transition and energy demand going forward, much more than in fact private mobility solutions, including e-mobility. Public transportation holds the key, and that is why not only we have 1,000 kilometers operational, we have equally another 1,000 kilometers that are underway. So this will, if we can integrate the public transportation network, our carbon emissions and also cleaner air and road congestion, all these dimensions will be addressed by utilizing public transportation infrastructure more efficiently. In terms of rural economy, the Swachh Bharat Mission, 11.8 crore toilets in villages. Mission Amrit Sarovar, again, if you look at the chapter on in agriculture and in industry, we talk about the importance of rejuvenating water bodies in contributing to the entire community development rather than purely providing water sufficiency. The National Health Mission, Sansad Adarsh Gram Yojana, empowering members of parliament to adopt villages and contributing to village development. Jal Jeevan Mission, 12.2 crore households provided, and Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana Grameen, 2.7 crore houses completed. Now, in terms of infrastructure, it is not enough to talk only about the physical infrastructure. We have done quite well with respect to at the general government level, not just the union government. The overall expenditure has gone up from 10.4 lakh crores across the country between center and states to 25.7 lakh crores on social services, primarily health, education, etc. And this is a growth rate of more than this is the multiple of about 2.5 times in the last 7 years. And in terms of the building blocks for better education, the foundational literacy and numeracy, central and state government initiatives are covered. One is the Nipun Bharat initiative, the mission to ensure that every child attains foundational literacy and numeracy by the end of grade 3 by 2026. Some of the specific examples are also covered in the economic survey. Initiatives and interventions in states like Bihar and Gujarat are also given adequate coverage in chapter 11 of the economic survey. Apart from that, we also highlighted several private sector not-for-profit initiatives in these dimensions, whether with respect to learning or social and emotional learning, which are not typically covered in classroom textbook learning. All the private sector initiatives or not-for-profit initiatives that can be replicated and scaled up, and specific state-level initiatives that are working well, which can also be considered as possible models to be adopted elsewhere. We have covered them in great detail in chapter 11. The good news is that the proof of the pudding is there in the data. The latest annual State of Education report for 2024, which Pratham brought out a couple of days ago, the proportion of standard 3 children in government schools who can read up to standard 2 has gone up from 16.3% to 23.4%. And in middle school, major improvements in basic reading and arithmetic seen in all grades, and the progress at the high school level, more than 75% can do basic digital tasks. And the same report also covers the availability of infrastructure that facilitates learning in the classroom in terms of midday meal being served, drinking water availability, usable toilets, and usable toilets for girls in particular as well. In all these areas, in the last 6 years, there has been noticeable improvement as well. Skilling initiatives found a prominent place in the last budget presented in July. And many of these initiatives, in fact, it looks as if I have to give you a specific glossary for this slide alone in terms of the number of abbreviations that are being used here. CTS stands for Craftsman Training Scheme in Industrial Training Institutes. PMKVY is Pradhan Mantri Kaushal Vikas Yojana, and Jan Shikshan Sansthan is JSS, and NSTI is the National Skill Training Institutes. NAPS stands for National Apprenticeship Promotion Scheme, and NCVET stands for National Council for Vocational Education Training. With this glossary out of the way, now we can look at the statistical landmarks and achievements that we have presented to you here in this slide. So in terms of Craftsman Training Scheme, 1.24 crore people have enrolled, and in the Kaushal Vikas Yojana, 1.57 crore people trained, etc. I will refrain from reading out all the statistics out here, but the important point is the industry partnership that is coming up in the apprenticeship promotion scheme and in the internship scheme as well. I think last economic survey spoke about the need for academic, industry, and government partnership, and this is an example of that in the skilling space as well. Moving on from physical infrastructure, education, and skilling to health, the Affordable Medicine and Immunization Program through the Jan Aushadhi Kendras, over 14,000 are operational. Full immunization coverage is happening. Disruptive technologies, including drone technologies, being deployed to provide medicines in remote areas. And also, if you look at the health identity cards, Ayushman Bharat Health IDs, 72.8 crore IDs have been created, and 26.4 crore vaccine doses monitored and administered, and eSanjeevani is serving more than 30 crore patients as well. I'll move on to the next slide. While physical health is clearly manifestly important, what goes beneath the surface in many cases is the importance of mental health. And the Government of India has been cognizant of the importance of maintaining mental health as well. Many initiatives have been taken. The National Mental Health Program, Tele Manas, which provides consultation over the phone, and there was a Mental Health Care Act leading to the setting up of 47 mental health institutes flowing from the National Mental Health Policy in 2014. And in terms of the Mittelstand, which I spoke about as an important lever or important ingredient of manufacturing, in the PLI schemes for white goods, we have covered a box item on the success of the air conditioners with respect to the PLI. The entire value chain for air conditioners manufacturing in the country is now in place. And particularly with respect to white goods, 43% of the new applicants in the scheme are micro, small, and medium enterprises. In terms of payment on time to micro businesses and small businesses, number of invoices financed on trades went up from 4.8 lakhs to 41.2 lakhs in FY24 in the last 4 years. That is a nearly 8 times jump in the number of invoices financed through trades. And the amount financed on trades has also gone up from 11,000 crores to 1.4 lakh crores. And many of you are aware of the Section 43BH, which allows businesses to deduct payments only after they make the payment in the year in which they make the payment to micro, small, and medium enterprises, rather than on an accrual basis. And MSME cluster development program has improved productivity by 10 to 15%. And in this regard, the survey also covers many initiatives taken by different states, from Gujarat to Madhya Pradesh to Rajasthan to Tamil Nadu, etc. We cover initiatives taken by several states for growing MSME businesses and attracting new businesses, which can serve as inspiration for other states as well. Harnessing the power of women entrepreneurs with respect to credit access, skill development, marketing support, and specific support for women-owned enterprises in terms of reserving public sector procurement for women-owned enterprises. So basically the point is, in the first two sections of this, in domestic drivers, we have spoken about the importance of deregulation. We have spoken about the importance of continuing with various initiatives that we have looked at in the previous surveys in terms of boosting the productive potential. This is all from the policy space. From there, we move on to the role of the private sector, because naturally for a large economy, private sector plays a very big role. And in terms of the private sector, the specific asks are balanced deployment of capital and labor, curbing ultra-processed foods, fairer distribution of incomes, which is related to the balanced deployment of capital and labor, importance to workplace safety, workplace culture and mental health, and thinking about supply and sourcing from a strategic perspective as well. Investment in R&D. So these are all the dimensions in which the private sector can also raise the game for the new playing field that we are confronted with today. In terms of fairer distribution of incomes, a topic which we brought up last survey as well, if you look at the growth in profitability and the growth in employment expenses, which is a combination of hiring and compensation, there is a huge disparity between the two, which has been highlighted by several private sector players themselves in the last few months. And this happened even as Indian corporate sector profitability hit a 15-year high in March 2024. And some of you may have heard that when in the 1960s, when Henry Ford raised the minimum wages for his car workers, he said, otherwise there will not be enough people to buy the cars the Ford Motors produces. So in some sense, raising wage and salary growth for workers is also a source for aggregate demand for businesses in the medium run as well. So it is both, it is enlightened self-interest rather than being seen only from a moral prism as well. And in terms of balanced deployment of capital and labor, the clear example is the use of artificial intelligence, and we have a special essay on this topic in chapter 13. In July 2024, we spoke about the energy demand management in a special essay on dealing with climate change. This time, the special essay is on the impact of artificial intelligence on employment generation and in general on labor. Deployment of artificial intelligence presents both opportunities and challenges. Past technology revolutions in general, sometimes we all feel that technology eventually generates more jobs than it displaces. That is true. But the key word is eventually. What happens between now and eventually is critical. And that is where I think we need to create supporting institutions, enabling institutions to train them, to prepare them, and academic curriculums have to change, workplace practices have to change, etc. So therefore, technological transitions have not been painless in the past, particularly during the previous 3 industrial revolutions in the Western world, and we need to learn from them, and that is what this chapter covers. And the private sector therefore needs to weigh the benefits of artificial intelligence against the social cost, which may be subterranean in nature and which may surface over a longer period, eventually affecting the environment that is necessary for running businesses smoothly. And therefore, the chapter argues for a careful deployment optimized over a long horizon. This will augment labor and will deliver broad-based social benefits. Of course, one of the considerations, if I may say in a lighter vein, when we wrote this chapter was whether the chapter would become outdated by the time it goes to print, given the kind of fast changes happening in the artificial intelligence space. But the issues that are discussed here is not with respect to the technological developments per se, but also whether the potential and the threat the technology poses for augmenting labor or displacing labor. Those issues are discussed in chapter 13. And where else a private sector can contribute? Compared to several countries, when it comes to R&D spend, 50% of it happens from the government and only 41% happens from business enterprises. Even higher education, academic institutions only contribute 9% compared to other countries. I think this is one area where I think the private sector and people like Mr. Naushad Forbes, etc., have actually written about it. The funding of R&D in India is predominantly from government entities, and it is not for lack of incentives. Specifically, box item 7 in chapter 7 covers the various incentives that the government of India offers in comparison to peer countries, and they are definitely comparable. And R&D in India is primarily driven by business enterprises in many other economies, and whatever R&D happens in the private sector in India is not only low, but is also sectorally concentrated, and that is one area of improvement. Ultra processed foods. It is a 2.5 lakh crore business built on hyper palatability of food items. Misleading advertisements, celebrity endorsements, and missing and obscure labeling on packages targeting consumer behavior. Ultra-processed foods are directly associated with exposure to cancer, respiratory, cardiovascular, and gastrointestinal health outcomes. And poor dietary intake, unfortunately, is also associated with adverse mental health, and most UPF brands target children and adolescents. Therefore, we need to arrive at a quick resolution on the issue pertaining to front of the pack labeling, which has been happening in fits and starts in this country. And this is not just purely about consumer information and fair disclosure. It has got long-term implications for realizing our demographic dividend and productivity of our youth. Because we initiated the coverage of mental health in a big way in the last survey, and we continue that in this survey as well, and you can find more of it in chapter 11. 4 particular variables have a big implication for mental health.
those who rarely use smartphones, those who are close to their friends and relatives, and those who basically have social connect and physical activity and who consume healthy foods, they have a very high mental score. But if your consumption of ultra processed foods is frequent, and if your family closeness is not much, and nor do you have enough free time for yourself out in the open, and if you rarely exercise, then your mental well-being score is very low. It is not a theoretical construct, it is an empirical finding across the world, including in India. And lower mental health naturally has a direct correlation with the number of working days and overall productivity as well. So in general, workplace culture, private sector's attitude towards ultra-processed foods, prioritizing medium term over short term, all these considerations will eventually determine whether India's wanted demographic dividend actually materializes or not. And I think this is a very important issue. Rather than, apart from skilling and education, etc., this is not widely discussed, and we feel this is an important area where private sector can contribute a lot. Energy transition the Indian way, which is the topic in the chapter on climate change and adaptation. A well-known French economist, Jean Pisani-Ferry, in the context of Europe, wrote that there is an impossible trinity of net zero. That is, policy cannot be at the same time fiscally sustainable and the economy is competitive without giving up on net zero ambitions. And that is what we call it, the impossible trinity of net zero. On the right side, between fiscal sustainability, net zero goals, and competitiveness of the economy at any given point in time, only two are possible. If you want to pursue net zero and be competitive also in the global economic space, then there has to be a lot of subsidization that has to happen. If you want to be fiscally sustainable, on the other hand, and also be economically competitive, Europe is realizing that net zero goals will become that much more challenging to pursue. Again, the Mario Draghi report on competitiveness has a lot to say on this with respect to Europe, and it applies to developing countries like ours as well. At the same time, if you want to pursue net zero, at the same time be fiscally prudent, then competitiveness will take a big hit as well, because energy costs will go up significantly, as has happened in Europe between pre-COVID and post-COVID. So the net result is that the trade-offs in climate mitigation is such that these days countries are realizing that we need to spend a lot of effort and resources on adaptation. The theme of the chapter on climate this time is how do we maximize our adaptation efforts, adaptation funding, as opposed to focusing on emission mitigation. India's energy transition, therefore, needs to have a multifaceted approach. It cannot be only about renewable energy, and renewable should be expanded to include transition fuels like natural gas and also, more importantly, nuclear power as well. And coal will continue to remain the mainstay, even as we are making far better progress than many other countries on nationally determined contributions. In fact, India's use of coal has not come in the way of India making much better progress on NDCs compared to Western nations. These considerations are discussed in great detail in the chapter on climate and also in chapter 5 as well. In terms of financing, much of the flows today are concentrated on emission mitigation, but critically important given the fact that the greenhouse gases already in the atmosphere will anyway cause global warming and damage to countries' environment. Countries need to generate more adaptation financing. In fact, Nobel laureate Thomas Schelling very clearly said, if per capita income growth in the next 40 years compares with the 40 years just before that, vulnerability to climate change should diminish and the resources available for adaptation should be greater. I say this not to minimize concern about climate change, but to anticipate whether developing countries should make sacrifices in their development to minimize the emission of gases that may change the climate to their disadvantage. Their best defense against climate change may be their own continued development. Basically, the point is, economic growth and development generates the resources to be able to deal with energy transition and climate change, and therefore, if we have to continue to grow, while making energy transition, prioritization should be on adaptation. And apart from the strategic considerations I mentioned earlier in terms of ensuring that we are not affected by the single source concentration risk that many countries, including India, are exposed to. And as we wrote in the last economic survey in chapter 13, the power of collective action, small changes, big impact, has to be also kept in mind. The lifestyle for environment movement, small individual actions, impact of lifestyle changes. A 13% change in global population behavior can reduce carbon emissions. For example, having the thermostat at 26 degrees or 27 degrees and having a small fan circulation will keep the room cool than keeping the thermostat at 20 degrees in summer, for example. Food waste reduction. Finishing food on a plate can save 90 kilograms of food waste per person annually, cutting down carbon emission and food loss. Carpooling and public transportation, which I alluded to earlier, can cut down transport sector emissions. Carpooling can save 380 million liters of fuel daily in India by reducing nearly 8 lakh rides per day. And public transportation, in terms of integrated solutions, is much better than focusing on tailpipe emissions through e-mobility, which also has a strategic angle to it. Recycling power. Recycling 1 ton of newspaper can prevent 25,000 liters of water wastage, contributing to more efficient resource use. Finally, we come to the state of the economy, which is the current. The economy grew 6% in the first half, and second half it is poised to do better. Growth remains close to decadal averages, especially if you look at agricultural sector, gross value added, industry. They all have grown better than the average over the entire period between FY15 and FY24 in FY25. Services sector is almost there, but overall the point is that the pandemic effects have completely now been erased from the trend growth estimates. And you can see that in the different components of expenditure-based GDP. Gross fixed capital formation has improved from 28.2% to more than 30%. And consumption share, private consumption share has gone up from 58.7% to 61.8%. And government expenditure has come down, in fact, from 10.8 to 10.3% compared to FY18. And export share also has gone up from 18.8 in FY18 to an estimated 21.5% in FY25. So basically, compared to the pre-pandemic shares of GDP, there is a good contribution or a better contribution coming from exports and gross fixed capital formation and private consumption as well. And this is what I mentioned in the previous slide. If you look at the overall GVA, on the top left, it has caught up with the trend growth, pre-pandemic trend. Agriculture has been above pre-pandemic trend, partly because of the growth in allied services, which I showed you earlier, which is high single-digit growth rates. And industry has now just popped its head above the pre-pandemic trend, bottom left. And with respect to the overall services sector, again, we have caught up with the pre-pandemic trend as well. Inflationary pressures have come down, barring a few items. If you look at the left side, you see the core inflation, core food, consumer food price index, overall core inflation, and the CPI inflation. Core inflation is below 4%, overall inflation is 5.2%, and the food price inflation index is close to about 8%. But if you remove specific items, then you can see that overall inflation trends are very subdued, and that is what the right side chart confirms for us. Headline inflation is 5%, but excluding tomatoes, onions, and potatoes is about 4%. Excluding pulse and vegetables is below 4% as well. In terms of export growth, while the headline numbers in merchandise exports may appear subdued, if you strip out petroleum and gems and jewelry, the growth is close to 10% between FY24 and FY25 in the first 8 months of the current financial year. And services sector in general have continued to grow in terms of the surpluses, and in the first half of the first 9 months of April to December 2023 and 2024, there has been a bigger surplus on the services trade
as well. Naturally, all of this resulting in a balance of payments which is very comfortable. Around 1% of GDP is the current account deficit. And therefore, financing this current account deficit has been not a problem despite successful and profitable exits by many businesses in the last 2 years. Even as the gross inflows are improving, the repatriations on account of profitable exits or transfer of ownership from direct to portfolio investors hasn't posed a problem for the current account because of the subdued oil prices, strong private transfers, and good export performance in the services sector, contributing to a current account deficit which is just around 1% of GDP. The growth outlook for FY26, we projected 6.5% to 7% for FY25, and this time we are projecting a growth outlook between 6.3 and 6.8% for FY26, which is in line with the projections made by many international organizations as well. The risk factor, of course, again, not only because of the changes in the global playing field, global stock markets also have become lately volatile, as we witnessed earlier this week. And we have an interesting box item in chapter 2 looking at the correlation between S&P 500 and the Nifty indices. Whenever in the last 24 years, since the millennium began, whenever the S&P 500 corrected, what was the impact on Indian stocks and vice versa. So that is a factor that we need to keep in mind, because the massive growth in retail participation in the Indian stock market is definitely a good thing. But also, when the market corrects, it could have implications for spending intentions, and sentiment effect, etc. could be significant. And that is one risk we have kept in mind when we came up with the outlook between 6.3 and 6.8% for the real GDP growth. And as we always say, we will be very happy to be proven to be wrong and conservative if the final outcome turns out to be better than 6.8 as well. So, to sum up, how do we raise our game for a new playing field when globalization is no longer going to provide the tailwind in terms of export growth and foreign investment growth? We need to deregulate to make it easier for small and medium enterprises to grow. Deregulation is about removing the fear of growth in micro, medium, and small enterprises. And this is about the plumbing and the nuts and bolts of deregulation, which are primarily there in the state and local government space. We have to continue to augment internal capacities for growth. Particularly, agriculture sector has a potential to contribute up to 1% to GDP growth. Private sector can do its part in terms of lifting the spending on R&D, in terms of striking a better balance between capital and labor share in their businesses, in terms of marketing of ultra-processed foods, and taking mental health seriously as well. With respect to energy transition, considerations of financing, considerations of supply chain concentration risk, etc. means that we need to focus on public transportation and adaptation as an important strategy rather than emission mitigation, in relatively speaking. Business as usual across all sectors, academia, private sector, governments, etc., business as usual carries the risk of growth stagnation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for the presentation. Now floor is open for the questions. So starting with 127. Please introduce yourself and your organization's name, and then mic at 127.
Hi, sir. Good evening. Hi, sir. Good evening. This is Ruchi Bhatia from Bloomberg News. This is Ruchi Bhatia from Bloomberg News. Your economic survey, sir, did make a case for deregulation and asking states to really get out of the way so that businesses can do better. I just want to understand from you, what can the federal government really do to nudge or prod states to get out of the way to be able to deregulate in a more extensive way?
I think more than the federal government nudging them, the successes of states that have done deregulation more than others, which is what the chart on the progress in Business Reform Action Plan, BRAP, and level of industrial activity, that should in and of itself be a sufficient motivation.
4.
So Timsi Jaipuria, this side from CNBC TV 18. Sir, your survey did mention about employment. It also warned about AI taking away a lot of roles, but also said that employment at the level when it comes to the private sector, a lot of working hours need to be managed. At factory level also, working hours need to be regulated. There should be a flexible working hours to be given to the employees. What is it that the government has in its mind for the private sector on employment, be it generation of employment, be it the working hours, or as you made a case for salaries, wages to be enhanced? You gave a very clear example of Force Motor saying that if salaries increase, only then people can buy the cars that Force Motors is manufacturing. So given all of this, what is your view or what government can do on the employment side?
Again, what the government can do was already demonstrated in the July budget of last year, when the government announced multiple schemes to incentivize labor augmentation in businesses, both in manufacturing, non-manufacturing, new jobs, adding to existing payrolls, etc., by defraying some of the contributions to EPFO, announcing the corporate internship scheme. So what the government can or should do was extensively mentioned, and even policy actions taken in the last budget of July 2024. And of course, the government can continue to take policy actions as it has been doing with respect to PLI schemes on labor-intensive sectors. And also in terms of the deregulation action, that is the government's, not just the union government, but the state governments and local governments' contribution to employment generation is by reducing the fixed cost of doing business so that firms can raise the variable cost by hiring more people. Beyond that, I think not everything needs a policy tweak or a policy intervention. Some of it is in the natural self-interest of businesses to be able to find this balance. And that is why I gave the example of Mr. Henry Ford. I'll just ask my colleague Anuradha, do you have anything to add? No? Okay.
2.
Dr. Nageswaran Karishma, this side from Business Today. The previous economic survey had mentioned about the China Plus One strategy and how India could draw dual benefit out of it. But this one does not explicitly mention it. Does this indicate a change of stance of the government, or the strategy is still a part of it?
Oh, there is nothing. This time we are speaking about the importance of importance to be given to domestic growth drivers, building domestic supply chain resilience, which is the same as what has been the thought process behind the Atmanirbhar Bharata, China Plus One, etc. So this is the continuation of the same theme.
122.
सर, मैं लक्ष्मण हूँ CNBC आवाज़ से। छोटे छोटे 2 सवाल हैं। एक तो आपने सर्वे में कहा है कि फैक्ट्री एक्ट को अमेंड करना चाहिए ओवर टाइम लिमिट को बढ़ाने के लिए। अभी 2 बड़े CEOs ने, एक ने 90 आवर पर वीक, एक ने 70 आवर पर वीक का सजेशन दिया है। आप इसको किस तरीके से देख रहे हैं? सेकेंड थिंग कि जो ट्रंप के आने के बाद एक टैरिफ का जो कंसर्न है, ये कितना बड़ा कंसर्न आपने फैक्टर इन किया अपने ग्रोथ आउटलुक में?
I don't want to go into the discussions that are currently happening in the private sector on the number of hours. So that is not something that we want to join. The point here is that small businesses do get seasonal surges in orders. and it will be good for them to have the flexibility to be able to achieve the weekly working hour limits over a longer period, which countries like Korea, Japan, etc. do that. So it is all about managing the seasonal surge in businesses. We are not going into the question of number of hours that Indians need to work, etc., which is a debate happening elsewhere. It is very difficult to give you a quantitative estimation with respect to the impact of trade policies that may be pursued by other countries, because right now it is hypothetical and speculative. But in general, what we have done is to take into consideration the uncertainties posed by the current global environment in terms of rising trade restrictions, rising investment restrictions, and therefore the growth number that we have spelled out does reflect these uncertainties, broadly speaking.
39.
So, Meghna Mittal from Money Control. You have emphasized on the risks that are there because of increasing dependence on a single country for energy transition, whether it's EVs or solar energy. I want to understand, are there any policy initiatives that India can still take to boost domestic manufacturing, or have we missed the bus? What are your thoughts?
No. Actually, we have been taking those policies. That is why we have already built several elements of the solar energy supply chain in India. Capacities have increased, whether it is in panels or modules or cells, etc. But at the same time, dependence also is there at a significant level. So it is not as if India has been passive and idle and simply depending on imports, whether it is in electric vehicle mobility or the battery cell components or in the components that go into solar panels, etc. Domestic capacity increase is happening. But given the state of demand and given the projections for demand growth, dependence also will continue to be there. And therefore, we need to, this is something that one cannot give a mechanical or a formulaic answer, but it is about the consciousness with which we basically adopt multiple approaches to handling this supply chain dependence for the foreseeable future. And one of the answers we gave was, therefore, public transportation, giving an important role for nuclear power, transition fuels, etc., are all parts of the strategy. I'll ask my colleague Chandani if she has anything more to add as well.
I think in addition to that, the government has also provided direct incentives for battery storage and also for electric vehicles manufacture. And on the issue of diversifying our sources of energy, there is a clear push by the government to diversify. So while we are doing renewable and non-fossil fuel, but there is a move, as was mentioned in the budget announcements last year, to also look at nuclear for small modular nuclear reactors. So there is a discussion and there is a push to become more and more energy secure for India's growth. Thank you.
26. From left side.
Sir, Rishabh Bhatnagar with NDTV Profit. My question is, in the Eco Survey, you've recommended private investments in for small-scale farmers. What exactly does this entail? Is this privatizing parts of agriculture? And secondly, the Eco Survey also talks about yes, page 249. And secondly, Eco Survey also talks about CBAM and EUDR as protectionist garbs. What exactly is India doing to sort of protest these on a diplomatic level?
So in agriculture, there is, if you go back to the economic survey, you would see how much has been the credit flow to the farmers, how much of that has increased. And there was also a slide here which said that it's actually enhanced substantially. Also, there is a shift away from money lenders, the traditional means of financing their investments, towards institutional lending. And that has, in fact, from 90%
that used to actually go to money lenders for their resources. It's down to less than 30%, which is much less than 30%, which is an indication that the institutional investing through and the farmers are accessing that. In addition, for working capital requirement, the Kisan Credit Scheme card, the Kisan credit cards have worked very well to enhance that the availability of financial resources for them to manage their working capital requirements. In the long run, the private sector, as in the corporate private sector, will also need to invest, because that is where the resources for capital investments will, that are required for agriculture will come in. On the issue of CBAM, so this is, CBAM is a border, it's a carbon border adjustment mechanism, as it's called, and it's a levy that would face countries that have emissions in their products, embodied emissions, greater than a certain factor. It is in a way, it's a non-trade tariff measure. It's a non-tariff barrier, and it does not take into account the fact that countries like India, we are at a different level of development, so there is clearly, and we see this as a means to a protectionist means to protect the European industry, and more than just the stated goal of reducing carbon emissions, because the end result, and there are discussions on that, and there is that it would only shift the carbon emissions from, at the moment they are consuming, because they are basically importing much of steel, let's say, but by this measure, they protect their own domestic industry, and the emissions will happen within their countries. So how much is going to be really stopped in terms of carbon emissions? There are a number of studies, and an UNCTAD report brings out the fact that there's not going to be much gained through that. So clearly a measure to protect their own industry. Thank you.
11.
Hello, sir. This is Surbhi from Business Today. Is it working? Yes. Sir, the survey has spoken about the rupee and how the dollar has gained strength over the last few years, and the rupee has still performed well, depreciating 2.9%. So do you see further depreciation of the rupee? Because a lot of analysts are speaking about, rupee touching 87 or 89, and how do you see it impacting the economy? Thank you.
I think it's this foreign exchange management related question is better posed to the central bank, and unfortunately they're not here. I think the recent actions taken by the central bank, either with respect to the rupee or with respect to domestic liquidity, are the right steps in the right direction, and I don't want to add anything more than that.
46.
Sir, Prakash Pedashu from ET now. Boosting domestic consumption is of course a key focus for the government at this point of time. Did economic survey make any specific recommendation to the government?
So what is the question?
The domestic consumption. I mean, boosting domestic consumption is of course a key focus for the government. So did the economic survey make any specific recommendation?
I'm not sure. Did the economic survey? I'm not sure, I really.
फिर से अपना क्वेश्चन दोहराइए प्लीज प्रकाश.
Has the economic survey made any specific recommendation to boost domestic consumption?
Yes.
Is that the question?
Yes.
Okay. Well, the recommendation which is made not just to the union government but to governments around the country is actually a step to boosting employment, income generation, and therefore consumption. This is about deregulation, is exactly towards that. It is not a recommendation only to the union government. So by simplifying regulations and by looking into the nuts and bolts of regulations that affect small businesses, we are lowering the cost of doing business for them, therefore opening up the space for them to hire more, which will lead to income growth and therefore better consumption. That is the very precise recommendation that the economic survey is making to governments all around the country.
52.
Good afternoon, Nikunj Johri from Reuters. I have two questions. You've cited geopolitical risks to India's growth, and we've seen persistent tariff threats from the United States. So, do you think India needs to have a preemptive policy, perhaps, or we need to our measures should be more reactive? And secondly. We've seen our net FDIs sharply coming down, although the gross FDI is increasing. There is a higher repatriation, as your presentation also stated. But the net FDI is sharply down. What do you think needs to be done to attract more FDI? The last year's survey suggested that India should open its door for Chinese investments. Lately, we've also seen de-escalation and resumption of direct flights. So, do you think the time is right now to lift the investment restrictions that we have on China?
So, Nikunj, with respect to your first question, the answer I gave to the gentleman from ET now is the same answer, which is that we don't want to talk about speculative scenarios of a single country's trade policies, etc. In general, I think the steps that we need to take, and in fact, the economic survey, the chapter on external sector, has a box item on trade policies and the kind of industrial policies that have been adopted by countries in the past, and how we can adopt industrial policy without necessarily being protectionist about it. At the same time, it can also be an inducement for productivity. We have discussed all those things, and that is the way to approach it. So I think there is no point in being speculative, and whatever policies that may need to be taken in response to or in anticipation, that I'm sure ministries are looking at it. Now, with respect to boosting FDI, I think we have made our recommendations, few suggestions in the last economic survey. But again, FDI is something, as we showed in one of the earlier slides, FDI as a share of GDP has come down much faster than the export share of GDP globally. And we are no longer competing only with other emerging market nations. We are even competing with industrialized countries which want to friendshore or onshore their investments. And therefore, so one of the biggest magnets for FDI is actually the prospect of profitable returns, which is what India has been providing, whether it is portfolio investors or direct investors. And the last 2 years of continuous exits actually demonstrate that.